Welcome. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies at the George Washington University, the International Security Program and the Middle East Program of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Middle East Program is directed by Holly Estefandieri, and the Security Studies is directed by Rob Litvak, and by the Los Alamos National Laboratory. My name is Joseph Pilat. I'm from Los Alamos and offer my welcome and the welcome of the laboratory to you. Today the meeting will run till 1:15, and after that we'll have a buffet lunch on the 5th floor. You're welcome to come. The topic today could not be more timely. The Iranian nuclear program is a growing concern. There are fears that it may be able to produce a bomb, some estimates in as little as a year, others several years. Despite the Iranian regime's continued protestations that the program is purely for peaceful purposes, the issue of deterring Iran is receiving more and more attention and reviving the post-Cold War debate that goes back as far, at least as Les Aspin, over whether so-called rogue states are deterrable. The issue of deterrence is on the table primarily because diplomatic efforts have faltered, and while they continue to be pursued, they appear increasingly unlikely to resolve the problem satisfactorily. Regime change from within appeared promising a year ago, but becomes increasingly unlikely as the regime has been able to crack down. And military options, while still advocated and still on the table in many arenas, are not appealing and may not be fully effective. With this situation, again, deterrence, if it can work, may offer a practical approach to the problem that is least worst in its nature. To explore these very complex and difficult issues, we're very fortunate today to have three distinguished speakers. Professor Amitai Etzioni, University Professor and Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies at the George Washington University. Ray Takei, Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Robert Litvak, Vice President for Programs and Director of the International Security Studies Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Let's begin. Professor Etzioni.
Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity and very much looking forward to the discussion. Let me start by saying that as somebody who has been in combat, most of it in close combat, for 2.5 years, there's nothing I abhor more than war. And I fully hold to the just war theory that we should engage in war only when there's a clear and present danger, only if all other means of resolving the conflict have been exhausted, and only to protect the innocent. But I also must add from experience and study that the notion that you can have a clean, little, neat surgical war in which only the bad people will be hurt and nobody else will be touched is a dangerous illusion. That is the reason, before we even think about war, we need to realize that once we step on that escalator, there are going to be lots of people hurt on both sides or all sides, which should be spared. Now, with this in mind, I return to the point we already was well introduced, that we really are talking about 4 options of dealing with Iran. One is the idea of engaging it, which President Obama tried quite consistently, and I think, I'm fair in saying, has been quite crudely rebuffed. The idea that sanctions can do what need doing, and I think there's growing consensus that sanctions are very unlikely to work, and that leaves us two options. One is the idea of deterrence, which, just to be explicit about that, it presumes that we will fully tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons, but will not be too concerned about it because we're going to deter them by threat of nuclear weapons the way we deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, the reason I'm going to focus on the deterrence concept is that the key to deterrence is the notion that the leaders of the power we're trying to deter are rational actors. And most of my discussion is going to focus on that concept. Frankly, if I had much more time, that's what I'm really interested in, because this issue is not just an Iran issue, it's a profound issue in social science. It's the heart of the economic man, the homo economist. It's at the heart of the libertarian theory. It's eating today into political science, into law and economics. Has enormous ramifications beyond the deterrence theory. My key argument is that the way the people who argue that people are rational, including the leaders of Iran, is really based on a linguistic trick, on a definition, and not on any reality. And basically, if you read carefully the arguments, and by the way, they also argue, the same people, that terrorists, including those who commit suicide, are rational. Then this is really achieved in two ways. One, what's called the social science tautology. You say, if the person did it, why wouldn't he do it if it wouldn't serve his purpose? And so this way, there's just no way to falsify the hypothesis. The economists have this wonderful story about a person who never bought a bottle of wine, never drunk, and never had any intention of drinking. And then he went downtown and bought a bottle of wine. And the economist says, is that irrational? Not to say. Why would I bought it otherwise? Well, that kind of word games, I don't think carries very far. The way this is done in the nuclear area is to say this. The leaders of Iran pay attention to facts. They don't simply disregard facts. And indeed, that's true. By far the best offer Iran made by the Europeans, which very unfortunately was rebuffed by the United States, was in May 2003. Now let that sink in for a moment. What happened in May 2003? This is when the United States blew away the Saddam regime in a few weeks without great effort after Iran tried to leave Iraq for 8 years unsuccessfully. And so they were very impressed. That also happens to be the week the head of Libya said, take away my weapons of mass destruction, I don't want them anymore. So they obviously pay attention to facts. And so the way the argument goes, if they pay attention to facts, they're not irrational, and therefore they're rational. But if you think for another moment, that allows for nothing in between. You're either not, or you are as empirical and logical as a computer can be, and there's nothing in between. What is in between is, first of all, something called miscalculations. Even computers make miscalculations, certainly people do. It's not that they're irrational, they just make huge mistakes. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and what were they thinking? Were they thinking they're going to wipe out the United States? Were they thinking the United States are not going to respond? They made a huge miscalculation, which cost them plenty. Not at the margin, it cost them their regime an enormous devastation. Hitler made terrible mistakes. He attacked Russia, while he could have taken Britain for the picking. History is full of gross miscalculation, not marginal miscalculations. So first of all, people who do pay attention to facts, who do strategize, can make horrible mistakes. Second, and that's probably the biggest contribution of sociology to this discussion, there's something which is a third category, which sociologists call non-rational, and it refers to people who have value commitments, strong normative commitments, to things which are not subject to empirical discussion. They are so-called true believers. And a true believer can hold that God commanded him to go and say, wipe out Israel, or attack United States, or whatever their beliefs leads them to hold. And by the way, I want to be clear, I'm not kind of one-sided here. The Israelis can also be true believers. And so when they believe that they will never again submit to being wiped out like the Jews were in Europe, or that if never again is their belief, or if they think about Masada, in which the defenders fought the Romans and then killed each other rather than surrender, they are also quite willing and capable of doing things which the rational computer would consider non-rational, because they have their own true beliefs. True believers can do irrational acts. Maybe the most interesting case of this discussion is when you examine the way suicide is treated in these discussions, both about individual terrorists or about regimes who bet themselves and their country in these confrontations. So on the one hand, a suicidal person cannot be deterred. I mean, the notion you're going to sue them after they commit suicide doesn't impress them very much, or that you're going to jail them. They're not available. And so suicide, from a deterrence viewpoint, is the ultimate irrational act. But again, the people who champion rationality say, well, suicide serves their purpose. Any way you cut it, deterrence presumes the other person can be deterred, and either due to miscalculation or because they listen to voices other than the rationalists do, we cannot presume that they will not use the weapons to their command. Now here comes another rule which is very simple but terribly important. And that is the notion of, well, we can protect ourselves against all risks, and well, maybe they cannot be deterred, but what you have to think about here is the following rule about, to put a technical term just for one quick sentence, the difference between probability and disutility. And a quick way to make this point is like this. If I offer you a bet, $1, you have 99% probability of winning, I have 1%, I think you're all ready to go, no? If I now say $10, 99% you win, 1% I win, I think I'm going to get a lot of hands. If I ask you to place the same, on the same probability, 99 you win, 1% I win, $1 million. But if you lose, you'll have to pay. I'll garnish all your wages for the future. There's no escape. I don't think most of you will take this bet. So same probability, trivial probability, 1 out of 100. But if the disutility is that large, we have to worry about low probability, high disutility events. A nuclear attack may be a low probability, though I'm not sure how you calculate that, but it's surely of enormous disutility. And therefore, we'd rather be safe than sorry. Now, we come then to my last point. And the people who examine the military option have good reason when they say attacking the nuclear sites was not going to work. I was the guest of the reformers in Iran, and I spent 10 days traveling up and down the country. And they had a joke in those days which said that all the cement factories in Iran work for the government. And the point of the joke was that the nuclear sites are now well covered. Now, not necessarily cement, some are in mountains, some we don't know where they are, some in population centers. So, because we don't know where they all are, or at least cannot be sure, because they're well protected, some are inside mountains, some are in highly populated areas. There's some argument, so I'm not technically qualified, that if you attack them under certain conditions, they could release radioactive waves, which would be quite disastrous to the civilian population. I think all these are quite compelling reasons. Like attacking the nuclear sites directly is not a very appealing option. Well, I'm sorry, I correct myself. There are no appealing options in war. But an option which should be considered is really an extension of the sanctions by other means. I'm getting to my close. How do sanctions supposed to work? Sanctions supposed to inflict pain on the other country, ideally on the elites and not on the people, so it doesn't always work this way, to make them change behavior. Unlike the attack on nuclear facilities, whose purpose is destroy capabilities, sanctions want to lead the other party to do what you want to do. They don't destroy nuclear sites. They want to get you to destroy nuclear sites. Well, attacks on the Revolutionary Guard headquarters, on the speedboats they plan to use to attack our ships, on the encampments, on this huge building of the secret police I saw in the middle of Tehran. There are many other targets which are not nuclear, which, if they would be attacked, would have much less collateral damage and will impose pain, which may lead them, hopefully, to give up their nuclear programs. Now, at least I think we should not take the military option off the table, because discussing it, or at least having it on the map, to remind you what happened in 2003 in May, may get us where we want to without ever having to fire a shot. So let me close where I started. I think we should avoid wars by all means, by all means. But if we have to, we should remember that there are other options than directly focusing on the nuclear sites. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Etzioni. Let's turn to Ray Takei.
Thanks. I think this is on. Yes. In terms of discussing the sort of viability or the desirability of a containment policy, I think there are certain threshold questions and several assumptions. They're all assumptions by definition, therefore imperfect. In order to discuss containment, the first thing you have to consider is, why does Iran want nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability? Because that defines the kind of a containment posture that you may have to adopt. If it's an Iran that seeks such weapons capability for purposes of deterrence and regime survival, as perhaps other nuclear aspirants before it, then that's, once presumably they have that capability of deterrence and their concerns are assuaged, then it may be a manageable situation. If it is an Iran that seeks these weapons as a means of pursuing its regional ambitions, which are at odds with those of the United States, if it's an Iran that seeks such weaponry in order to brandish its influence and pursue its aspirations, then it is an Iran that seeks such weapons for more of an offensive capability. And I realize there's a continuum between the two. Namely, once you have a deterrence capability, you can feel certain immunities and therefore pursue your regional policies with a greater degree of ease and assertiveness. My suspicion is that is the latter case, that this is not a country that faces existential threats. And this is not a country that faces fears being militarily intervened from abroad. I mean, if you look at what its leadership is suggesting in terms of the threats that they face, they mostly talk about, sort of a soft revolution, internal subversion, and that sort of a thing. They're not talking about the possibility of Iran being subject to military attack, occupation, and so forth. So therefore, and nuclear weapons capability doesn't disarm an internal subversive threat. The Soviet Union collapsed when it had 20,000 nuclear weapons. So therefore, the nuclear weapons pursuit has to be considered in order to have a more of a aggressive regional policy. That defines the nature of your containment policy, should you have one. and altogether undesirable option, I might add. You can't really have a soft containment policy. For instance, the kind of a containment policy we enunciated toward China in 1964 when it detonated. We just came out and said, well, this is not going to change how we do things in the Middle East. This is not going to, in East Asia, and this is not going to change any aspect of our policies or priorities in East Asia. Thank you very much. I think the type of containment policy that we are likely to embrace, should it come to that, is likely to be more robust. It is likely to be more assertive. It is likely to be more confrontational. For several reasons. Number one is because there will be a degree of asymmetry between the United States and Iran at the time of Iran's documented and understood nuclear capability, because asymmetry by mean there's going to be asymmetry in the two countries' credibility. On the one hand, I think 3 administrations in a row in the United States have suggested that a certain outcome is unacceptable. And when it becomes real, the United States will face a degree of credibility crisis with its allies and its adversaries. And at that time, when an Iranian government that has successfully defied international pressures, which are rather substantial, and pledges of 3 administrations, maybe 4 by then, and achieves that capability, is likely to feel some degree of the winds being at a sail. And also there'll be a political reality here at home where no chief executive can go and say, well, this is not going to change things. Our priorities and policies remain. That may be true. The practicalities of power may remain the same, but the perception of power would have changed. And as Jack Kennedy said, perception is reality. Therefore, the containment lines that we are going to draw are likely to be vigorous. And I suspect, at the very least, it will have 3 red lines that we will draw for both practical and political purposes. Number one, the obvious one, no transference of nuclear technologies and nuclear resources. Now, I mind you that we will suggest to Iran no transference at a time when Iranian leadership today, and for several years, has insisted that its nuclear program and the fruits of that nuclear program are subject to shared by like-minded states, whoever they are. So we would invoke non-transference toward a regime that rather persistently has suggested that its nuclear resources are indeed for the purpose of transference. They may not transfer them once they get them, but, you know, the declared policy of the Islamic Republic today is that it will share peaceful nuclear technology with other actors. So we have no transference rule. I think it goes without saying that you have to suggest that Iran with nuclear weapons, it is a red line, should not begin a conventional attack against any of its neighbors. And I think that red line is rather easily enforced, because this is not a state that is revisionist territorially and tends to rely on subversion and terrorism and other such measures to project its power. The third, and this is going to be rather amorphous and difficult, namely that somehow we are going to try to negate Iran from using its nuclear resources, nuclear weapons, as a means of gaining diplomatic or political leverage in the region and enhancing its support for its terrorist clients. Very sort of, as you can see, rather an amorphous line, but I think in the context of the time when Iran becomes a nuclear weapons power, should it become a nuclear weapon power, it is almost necessary and inevitable. So you have the United States government drawing several acute red lines with the Iranian government that, at least in the initial stage of its nuclear empowerment, it is likely to test American will. That's how much they can get away with. And it is that process, it is that time period that is likely to produce what I would say is military clashes between the two states. I think for too long we have thought about several independent boxes. There's the containment box, there's the use of force box, and there's the diplomacy box. In reality, they're concentric, and they're all related. A containment policy may likely lead to use of force by the United States against Iran to enforce its transgressed red lines. Should Iranians not abide by those red lines, and there's no reason to believe they would. A containment policy will entail enormous degree of diplomacy. Namely, the two powers will have to embark on a course of regular and systematic dialogue. That's diplomacy. So containment policy is an inclusive concept. If you want to opt for containment because you recoil at the use of force, then the nature of the containment policy that you draw would have to be different. You have to have a sort of a, as I said, a very ambiguous containment policy, and we've done that before. I mean, the most adroit practitioner of that was Dwight Eisenhower, in case the way he dealt with the Chinese, where he kept them guessing about the means and places of choosing of American retaliation, whether he would retaliate and so forth. But, Eisenhower also had credibility because he was the guy who beat Hitler. Unlikely we'll have a chief executive with that degree of military capability or credibility. So containment can possibly lead to the use of force if it's drawn along the lines that I suggest. Containment also will complicate America's approach to Gulf security. Because I think if you look at the Gulf today, we have a sort of an anachronistic policy. We have a 1970s policy toward the 21st century Gulf. I mean, $60 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia that's been announced. I'm not quite sure what purpose that serves. It deals with threats that aren't obvious to me and exacerbate those that are latent. But we have a 1970s policy toward the Gulf. And that 1970s policy, which is debilitating and anachronistic, is likely to be further reinforced by the arrival of a nuclear Iran. Now, if I unpack this, in my opinion, we are increasingly getting to a point where the Persian Gulf sub-region of the Middle East is self-regulating. It doesn't have territorially revisionist states, Saddam's Iraq, for instance. And Iran was never territorially revisionist. It's no longer the Gulf that is tempted by transnational ideologies, whether the ideological power of Iranian Islamic message or the sort of a Baathism of Saddam. So those transnational ideologies have largely faded. And it is likely to be a Gulf which, in my opinion, is, if we are judicious, is not going to require an enormous degree of American deployments or American arms sales. However, the one factor that disrupts the emergence of this new Gulf, which may be pacific in terms of its alignment, is the arrival of a nuclear Iran, because whether it's necessary or not, by definition, we are going to react to that by arms sales to client states and deployment of American forces and fortifications and so forth. So at the time when we may be able to finally extricate ourselves from the Gulf commitment, a nuclear Iran will get us sucked back into that region in a far more significant manner. So prevention of Iran having that capability means we can finally lessen our presence in the Gulf and maybe get to a position of pre-1979 where we have a declared policy of believing that the Gulf boundaries are not to be changed and the Gulf commerce, principally oil, is going to be commerce that flows freely, but we are not going to have a cumbersome military presence in the region to enforce that, because that cumbersome presence is superfluous in absence of revisionist states, in absence of transnational ideologies which are alluring, and in absence of a nuclear armed state. And finally, I think there's too much discussion, maybe inevitably, in the United States about the inevitability of Iran having a nuclear weapons capability. I mean, to me, there's nothing inevitable about it. To me, there's nothing ideal about it, but nothing inevitable about it, whether it's through sort of a coercive sanctions policy that was discussed before, or otherwise. For Iran to achieve a nuclear weapons power, and for the United States to acquiesce to it constitutes a great power acquiescing to a third-rate autocracy. How did we get to this position? I think Iran can be prevented from having nuclear weapons, and I think it can be prevented diplomatically without the use of force if we are capable of mobilizing our power and stressing our intentions in a rather unmistakable manner. We have a $1 trillion defense budget. Iran's whole GDP is not 2% of our defense appropriations. We have intact alliances abroad. Iran is a country without friends. We have a robust economy. Even now, Iran is a third-rate economy. It's a country distrusted by its neighbors. It's a regime disdained by its citizenry. I mean, how is it that we're acquiescing to this regime? It constitutes an ill definition of power and how power can be judiciously used to gain compellence without force. I think that's possible. It's what Eisenhower did, it's what we have done, various aspects of its history, but I think we kind of have misunderstood how to mobilize and utilize that power base. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ray. Now we'll turn to Rob Litvak.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to share a panel with Amitai and Ray. The Wilson Center's mission is not to advocate policy, but rather to improve the quality of public policy debate. And in keeping with that, the focus of my remarks will be on the character of the U.S. debate. How do we think about Iran's nuclear program? The answer to the question, can a nuclear Iran be deterred, depends on one's assessment of Iran's intentions and capabilities, what one might call reading Tehran and Washington. Our op-eds, pages, and blog sites are full of policy prescriptions. We're bombarded with them about how to deal with Iran's nuclear challenges. They divide roughly into the categories we've discussed already: contain, engage, strike. But each option is based on a key threshold assumption, an assumption which is often unstated or reflects an ideological predilection or some vain hope. Often they're not subjected to rigorous analysis. Consider the range of recent op-ed pieces. At one end of the spectrum, you have the military strike option on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Now, the underlying premise of some advocates is that the regime is a messianic, apocalyptic cult that is undeterrable. A variant of the military strike option is that a strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure could trigger a counter-revolution, a popular uprising against the regime. Other pieces talk about the utility of sanctions, and sanctions can be targeted. Here the proposition is that if you squeeze the core interest groups of the regime, like the Revolutionary Guards, that pressure will prompt a change in behavior. Or sanctions can be general, and here the proposition or premise is that if you squeeze the general population, that pressure will then be amplified and will create popular unrest to which the regime will have to respond. At the other end of the spectrum from the military strike option is deep engagement, and there are some who advocate not only engagement, believing a deal is possible, but have argued that we just haven't come up with the right carrots yet. We need to offer them bigger carrots, and then a deal is possible. Now, the point is not to advocate a particular option on that continuum, but really to just elucidate how options are linked to these key underlying assumptions and the need for rigorous analysis, because containment, engagement, deterrence are general concepts, and they require specific knowledge of the target state in order to be translated into a specific strategy. The political scientist Alexander George did path-breaking work on this topic. For example, we can look across historical cases at deterrence and develop it as a model. But you require the specific knowledge of the Saddam Hussein regime to answer the question, what would it have taken in the summer of 1990 to deter Saddam Hussein from invading Kuwait? Target state analysis is difficult because the regimes we're talking about, Iran, Iraq, all the hard cases, the autocratic hard cases, the decision-making is opaque. I mean, I talked to an expert on North Korea who said, we really basically know how they made two decisions because they were both taken in front of visiting U.S. presidents. Jimmy Carter in 1994 when they let IAEA inspectors in, 2000 with Madeleine Albright when Kim Jong-il allowed some narrowing of a ballistic missile range in the negotiations. That's what we know about North Korean decision-making concretely. And we know very little about Iranian decision-making because it's an opaque society. So we have to be somewhat humble in our claims about decision-making in Iran. Perhaps the best example of what I would call target state analysis was done at the beginning of the Cold War by George Kennan, the diplomat who wrote the path-breaking so-called X article in Foreign Affairs in 1947. Now, tellingly, the title of the article was "The Sources of Soviet Conduct." It wasn't "Containment, a New Strategy for Dealing with the Soviet Union." Kennan advocated containment as a doctrine, but the concept, or the strategy of containment, was embedded in a concept of societal change in Russia. That was its predicate. Kennan advocated a strategy to balance Soviet power until the inexorable contradictions of that society led to internal change. The importance of accurate target state analysis of the kind done by Kennan cannot be overstated. The United States' major foreign policy failures have arisen either from flawed target state analysis or from policymakers ignoring sound target state analysis. A generation ago, we paid the price in Vietnam. Over the last 8 years, we paid the price in Iraq. Political scientist Robert Jervis illuminates this problem when an untested proposition becomes a hard premise in his new book, Why Intelligence Fails. That book features a now declassified top-secret report he wrote for the CIA on the failure of the agency to predict the Iranian Revolution. And the riddle of the revolution, of course, was why didn't the Shah crack down on the dissidents and quash the revolution? The CIA's premise was that the Shah would do so if the situation reached a crisis point. And then when the Shah did not brutally suppress street demonstrations, that was taken by the CIA as an indicator that the situation was still manageable. Historically, deterrence has most commonly failed due to miscalculation stemming from misperception and miscalculation. Amitai alluded to that. For example, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait is now viewed broadly as a failure of deterrence. Now, in the case of Iran, the issue is not only miscalculation. That deterrence can be done, but there's always the risk of miscalculation. Rather, the crux argument of those advocating an alternative deterrence, specifically preventive military action, is that the Iranian regime is undeterrable, essentially a crazy state. The link between threat and the character of regimes has been a dominant theme of the U.S. security policy debate since 9/11. The Bush administration explicitly argued in 2002, its national security strategy document, that the Cold War concepts of containment and deterrence are, quote, less likely to work against leaders of rogue states who are more willing to take risks, close quote, and more prone than an orthodox great power, such as the Soviet Union and China, to use weapons of mass destruction. So as a consequence, the Bush administration, of course, elevated military preemption, not only preemptively against imminent threats, which is a usage consistent with international law, but also preventively against emerging threats. The Bush administration, of course, alluded to the nexus between proliferation and threat, proliferation and terrorism as sort of an urgent reason to elevate military preemption. And this assessment, of course, propelled the shift in strategy from containment and deterrence to regime change. The Bush administration argued that changing the behavior of these regimes was inadequate because the bad behavior flowed from the character of the regime. So to turn off the bad behavior, you had to change the regimes. That argumentation, of course, fed into the decision to invade Iraq. I'll return to the question of deterrence, but first let me address the other side of the question and equation and build on Ray's remarks. Iran's nuclear capabilities. What do we mean by a nuclear Iran? The answer to that is not clear. Through its uranium enrichment program, Iran has achieved a hedge or a breakout option to acquire nuclear weapons. As Ray mentioned, Iran's program is determined, it's incremental, but it's not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible in the face of an existential threat. It appears to be more like India's program. It's an aspiring regional power rather than states like North Korea, Pakistan, and Israel, which view nuclear weapons as an answer to an existential security threat. Iran's interest in the nuclear program is not specific to this regime, as the program began under the Shah. But the mastery of uranium enrichment technology calls into question the possibility of verifiable disarmament through negotiations. That type of agreement, an agreement to cap uranium enrichment, would require highly intrusive inspections and also challenge inspections at undeclared site. Now, the alternative for Iran to a hedge is weaponization. And weaponization can be undeclared, which is possible because Iran is testing of a weapon is less important with the uranium enrichment route, or it could be declared with a small arsenal, and Iran's developing ballistic missiles as well. The IAEA and reports that Iran is accumulating low-enriched uranium, which with further processing could yield an estimated, 1 or 2 weapons. And the IAEA pointed out most recently an accelerating loss of transparency in the Iranian program. In the absence of an urgent threat, Iran may choose to continue a nuclear hedge strategy. Given the regional reaction to an overt nuclear Iran, a hedge strategy might suit Iran's interests. Now, finally, let me turn to the Obama administration. The word that was used to describe its Russia relationship, reset, could also be used to describe the new approach it's taken towards Iran and other states that violate international norms. To begin with, the Obama administration has ended the mixed message coming out of Washington over whether the U.S. objective is to change the regime or to change the behavior of the regime, its conduct. The Bush administration never reconciled that mixed message. Obama has, and that condition, the limitation of objective, is a key condition for a successful coercive diplomacy strategy. Coercive diplomacy is not possible when your adversary believes that your objective is to change the regime, regardless of any change in their conduct. Now, the criticism of the Obama administration often belies a misunderstanding of engagement. And as Ray pointed out, containment, engagement, this isn't a dichotomy, it's a continuum of choice. And the Obama administration has not pursued a pure engagement strategy. Through its use of targeted sanctions, it is trying to raise the cost to the regime. Secretary Clinton calls this a two-track approach of pressure and engagement. The Obama administration, I would argue, has set a necessary but not a sufficient condition for success. The United States can't do it alone. And now it's up to others to decide what they will do. In particular, Russia, which is a pivotal actor. Does their peak with past U.S. policies, does that trump their interest in preventing another nuclear weapon state arising on the periphery? They'll have to make their own national choice on that. But I think the Obama administration has constructively clarified the U.S. policy. Has it worked immediately? No. Secretary Clinton says it needs time. But meanwhile, critics, one year into it, with reason are asking, if the question for Bush was, would he be willing to take yes for an answer, the critics are now asking Obama, are you willing to take no for an answer? And that proposition is to be tested. President Obama himself has speculated that the deal may not be possible. He's told the editors of newspapers recently, quote, it may be that the Iranian regime's ideological commitment to nuclear weapons is such that they're not making a simple cost-benefit analysis on this issue, close quote. As our former scholar Shahram Chubin pointed out, the nuclear issue is a surrogate for Iran of a more fundamental foreign policy debate over relations with the United States and the broader outside world. And ultimately over the Islamic Republic's identity, whether it's in a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. Now, we can discuss the limitations on the military option, which have been already touched upon by Amitai. We can develop that. The preventive military option is kind of rife with problems, but I think one should be, among the various problems, be clear that an attack would not end the program. As El Baradei says, you can't bomb knowledge. It would be preventive, not preemptive, because the risk is not, the threat's not imminent, and there would be a considerable risk of escalation. No American president could elect to bomb Iran without accepting the possibility that the United States would be at war with Iran. It's not just sort of, as a Wall Street Journal op-ed put it, one night only. A president would have to take into account the possibility of escalation. Let me conclude with a remark that a senior U.S. Asia hand once said of North Korea, which is, the North Koreans do not respond to pressure, but without pressure, they do not respond. The same could be said of the Iranians. The November 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, kind of much maligned, stated that Tehran's decisions are guided by a cost-benefit approach, indicating that the country does respond to external pressure. As one observer put it, a regime whose elite are stealing the country blind and buying villas in Dubai would not appear to be an apocalyptic suicidal regime. And those arguing for preventive military action, because deterrence will not work because of the character of the Iranian regime, must make the case that Iran is not guided by a cost-benefit calculation. Policy should focus on, and I won't develop it, but just second Ray's point about reducing the risk of miscalculation through clear communication, such as his red lines. In conclusion, the United States can realistically, I believe, aim to circumscribe but not end Iran's nuclear enrichment program. This hedge option that Iran has creates inherent ambiguity. Alexander George, whose work I cited earlier, said that the job of the policy analyst is to make an analytic judgment based on sound target state analysis and on rigorously assessing assumptions. Policymakers, though, must make a broader political judgment. And for them, they must weigh the risks. And the question in this context is, how much ambiguity is the United States prepared to live with? Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. With our three excellent presentations, we have a lot on the table. Questions? Yes. Please identify yourself. Do we have a...
Okay. Microphones.
I appreciate Dr. Lidwak mentioning preventive war and making clear that what we're talking about in the military option is exercising preventive use of force as opposed to preemption. This is often confused in dialogue here. And I also appreciated hearing from Professor Etzioni the notion of a just war, which is probably not mentioned as much as it should be. Am I wrong, though, in understanding that any discussion of keeping the military option on the table is really an assertion that we need to maintain the right of unilateral preventive action against Iran, which traditionally in Nuremberg means waging illegal war. And is that not, it used to be in 2002 when the Bush-Cheney administration introduced the concept, it was controversial. And yet it seems that since it's not really talked about in our dialogue about keeping the military option on the table and attacking Iran, that this seems to now be generally accepted, that this is legitimate American behavior in the world today, and not only legitimate, but is at the forefront of those who advocate military action against Iran.
Well, Amitai has developed this in his writings on communitarianism, and he and Ray can comment on that. But we had a scholar at the Wilson Center, Sir Adam Roberts, who referred to intervention as the worm in the apple of the liberal international order. And he said that the Bush administration could have saved itself a lot of angst and kind of political heartburn if they just stipulated up front that the norm in international relations is non-intervention, but that in the face of kind of an urgent perceived threat, that the use of force is kind of one carve-out. Now, the question is, the prevention-preemption debate. The use of force can, win international legitimacy in the face of an imminent threat. but prevention will never win the day in the face of a non-imminent threat. And so if the United States were to use force against Iran, against what the rest of the world community would largely view as sort of a non-imminent threat, I think we'd come under kind of enormous criticism. Mitchell Reese refers to the preemption paradox, that military action is easy early on when the capabilities are just evolving and have not really developed. It's militarily easiest early on, but politically the most difficult. It gets politically more easier as the capabilities become more overt, but then it becomes militarily more difficult to do. So there's no answer per se. It's really just a question of a judgment about weighing kind of risks.
Professor Ciani?
I'll immediately turn to your question, but I first want to do the academic thing and give you some more footnotes. So it's an excellent article by Ray in Foreign Policy on after Iran gets the bomb, so I recommend you reading, and also his article in the Washington Post, How Containment Could Mean War. So that's two other sources for your consideration, and my own views are in a recent issue of the military review. I just would very much agree with what has been said, that in terms of informal norms, the international community is very likely to be condemning if the United States would use its military force against Iran. So to some extent it would depend to what degree if the United States makes it clear that it tried everything else. It tried to engage and so on and so on. But my really more relevant point is slightly different. When people quote the international law as it was clear and cut and unambiguous, and that's what international law is, and anything different, let's just remind us that even domestic laws are subject to interpretations and recalibrations. New creations, the Miranda rights didn't exist in the 1960s. Since then, they've been reformulated 3 times. So even on domestic law, to say that's what the law says is a somewhat risky line. The right to privacy is never mentioned. I mean, I can go on the whole night to tell about that law is but the Constitution even is a living document. When it comes to international law, we don't have a world government. We have people on sit on the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, like of Libya and Cuba and such. So we surely need to take it into account, but looking at it and saying as if it's, I'll close on the New Yorker cartoon. And the New Yorker cartoon, Moses holds the tablets, and he says, actually they are carved in stone. Well, that may be true for the 10 Commandments, but it's not true for international law.
Yes. In the back here. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I am Dr. Sheikh Ahmed Sabhi Mansour, President of the International Quranic Center and a fellow here. My research, by the way, is the rules of engagement of war of ideas against jihadists. Actually, the real danger is not the Iranian nuclear weapon. The real danger is the mentality that controls this nuclear weapon and its desire to destroy the other camp and sacrificing themselves for the cause. And the real danger is also, it is impossible to deter or to stop this mentality. The key word here is the war of ideas from within Islam. This war of ideas, having Islam by sincere Muslim scholars who are experts in this field, is the only way to stop them, not only the Iranians, but also the other fanatics Wahhabis, to save them and to secure the American soil. Unfortunately, there are Muslim scholars, especially the Quranists, who have this expertise for 25 years, and they are eager to be protected from persecution in Middle East and to be supervised by the Americans. But until now, the American policymakers are reluctant or refusing to use them in this war of ideas. The question is how long it takes to convince the American policymakers to wage the war of ideas, the peaceful intellectual war of ideas, to save the world. Thank you.
I very much appreciate your comment, because I spent a whole year doing nothing but studying the point you made. And what you find is in all religions and in all major secular ideologies, the division between those who advocate violence and those who abhor violence. You find in Islam, with Sistani, for instance, being a major spokesman against violence. You find in Judaism between an eye for an eye, and then the rabbis come and say, no, it means you should compensate. And you find in Christianity, you find in socialism between Stalin and the Fabians. It's really crucial to realize that if you can have an alliance of the moderates against those who are willing to commit violence, then we're really going to win that war of ideas. But it's not a war about democracy and human rights. The notion that if you are not subscribing to our constitution and our political system, then you're violent, that pushes most people into the other camp. On the other hand, if you say, as President Obama said on January 20, you may be on the wrong side of history, but if you unclench your fist, we'll extend our hand to you. Unclench your fist, that's the only requirement he made. And I think it's very wise. One more line. Several times we already heard the term, Iran is engaging in cost-benefit analysis, which makes me need to repeat that a person and a country can engage in cost-benefit analysis, but doesn't mean that their definition of benefits is the same as ours. A secure place in heaven can be defined as a benefit and will lead you to do all kinds of things which your kind of benefit analysis will not lead you to do.
Thank you. My name is Shahryar Etzbidani. I'm from Iran Democratic Union. I want to start off just by a quote from the founder of the Islamic Republic. We do not worship Iran, we worship Allah. For patriotism is another name for paganism. I say, let this land, Iran, burn. I say, let this land go up in smoke, provided Islam emerges triumphant in the rest of the world. So that's the mentality of the leaders of the Islamic Republic that we are talking about containing. And in case people put that down to revolutionary rhetoric, let's look at what the Islamic Republic has done over the last 30 years without nuclear capabilities. From Lebanon to Iraq to Afghanistan to Buenos Aires to Gaza, they have been unbelievably disruptive. So we must look at the mentality of the Islamic Republic. And Professor Etzioni said very well that their definition of benefit could be different from ours, and therefore we might miscalculate what the cost-benefit analysis is. I would actually add that their definition of cost is absolutely different from ours. For they are willing to sacrifice their own people for the mentality, for their own ideological beliefs. And that was proven in the Iraq-Iran war, when Khomeini had the chance of ending the war after a year. And he prolonged the war for an extra 7 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, because he wanted to export his Islamic revolution. So the question actually I have, which is slightly different, is what really surprises me today and in general when listening to experts on this subject is Professor Etzioni, when I came in, was talking about various options that the United States has. Was war one extreme, containment the other extreme, and we have sanctions and diplomacy in the middle. the question is, why isn't anyone focusing on the best case scenario, which is helping the Iranian people get rid of the Islamic Republic?
I'll say a few things. I mean, you're quite right about the depiction of the founder of the Islamic Republic, who was transnational. I mean, he was willing to sacrifice a nation for sake of ideology. But since then, there's been, if you would, a moral degeneration of the Islamic Republic's elite. I mean, there are ideologues. It sort of looks like a Brezhnev state. There's some pursuing ideology, the others who are, happy with sausages and German films, and let's look for the right quotation by Lenin to justify this. I think containment is going to be difficult, arduous, and I'm not quite sure if it's plausible. And I think you're right in your larger point that the best way of dealing with the Iranian challenge is to invest in a political class that displaces pragmatism for dogma for pragmatism. I mean, I think you're right about that. The challenge is how you do it. The challenge is how to go about it. Because, as I mentioned in my comments, that we are dealing with a regime that's extraordinarily isolated within its country and divided within itself. It's the links between population and the state have been severed. In most other countries, they're organic. So you have an Islamic Republic that is in many ways anachronistic. It is a sort of a dogmatic leadership ruling pragmatic population. It is ideologically incendiary leadership ruling a fairly pacific population. The question is, how do you reverse that calculus? And I don't have any clever answers to that. I think your larger point that a different Iranian regime would behave better, and who's beholden to the Iranian people would behave better, is largely correct. I'm not sure how to foster that particular situation, and that's the conundrum.
I just, with permission of the chair, want to add one more sentence on the cost-benefit analysis. I'm old enough to have debated Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn, in On Thermonuclear War, made the argument, and he wasn't, I mean, actually by my scale he was a nut, but he was a major consultant for the Defense Department and such, and he argued that nuclear war was perfectly thinkable. We were going to lose 100 million Americans, but we're going to regrow, so why not? So keep this in mind when you think about cost-benefit analysis.
Can I just make one point about cost-benefit analysis? I think there is a sort of a perspective, a sort of a grand strategy of the administration, if I can decipher it and maybe present it cogently. Namely that there are these great powers, United States, Russia, China, and they have common interests. The problem with kind of putting those common interests together is lack of institutions. That's where there's so much talk about architecture. And I'm not intellectually sophisticated enough to know what that architecture means or how it evolves. Maybe Ed can explain it to me. And then there are states that are outside the parameters of international norms. And if those states are confronted with a choice of joining the community of nations or remaining outside the community of nations, then they'll make the right cost-benefit analysis. It is a paradigm, when you look at it, it has a lot of plausibility and intelligence in it, but it's one that's devoid of ideology. Everybody makes calculations based upon material advantage. I mean, there are some countries that want to be isolated. They see virtue and valor in isolation, in defiance, in resistance. And they rebuff attempts to essentially join the community of nations. So they do make a cost-benefit analysis. They think the benefit of isolation overwhelms the costs of engagement and the subversion of engagement. So,
it's right here.
David Aaron, Rand Corporation. First, on this question of cost-benefit analysis, I think if you go back to the situation with the Soviet Union, there was a great deal of discussion about whether they could be deterred and whether they were rational. And I think this question, of course, comes up in every deterrence situation. I think that issue was solved, in effect, by the fact that the stockpiles of nuclear weapons got to be so large that the cost was, of course, basically the extinction of the Earth. And the outliers who said, well, no, there's some virtue in pushing hard here, our ideology, even they had to recognize that whatever their values and whatever their benefits, that was the consequence of taking too aggressive a stance or provoking a nuclear war. I now want to turn, if I may, to Ray. In that context, then, this administration has basically put forward a deterrent strategy in the nuclear policy review paper that reduces the effect, or the saliency is the word they used, of nuclear weapons. And for countries in the Middle East, for example, it really very strongly suggests that any response to a nuclear Iran would be conventional. Shock and awe, basically. Do you think that prospect would deter Iran from taking an aggressive action in the Middle East?
If I can understand you, what you're suggesting, if a nuclear Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, in some eventuality, actually engages in aggression beyond its borders, the response of the United States and its allies will be conventional as well, and it won't be escalating.
That's what the document strongly suggests.
Right. I suspect if Iran were to actually use its nuclear weapons, the nature of that response would change. Well, I mean, the nature of response would change by the Israelis and others. So I'm not quite sure, and here I go back to the point that Rob made about the opacity of the Iranian political system, in the sense that they haven't articulated a sort of a strategic rationale for their nuclear program. Much of what we know or think about them is extrapolated from commentary and sidebar remarks and speeches and so forth. Some of those are for effect, some not. So we don't have a purview of Iranian strategic culture, if there is such a thing. So whether they will take a document that suggests that the response of the United States to an overt aggression by a nuclear Iran would be conventional response, and that essentially leads them to believe that there is this degree of impunity about having such weaponry, as I just don't know, because I just don't have that kind of this visibility. I'm not quite sure if they have thought that far through. You know, it'd be interesting to know that, but the sources that you would require to answer a complicated strategic questions like that are just not available. They're not available to me, and I'm sure they're not available to our intelligence community. But this is the problem with dealing with the issue of Iran and its nuclear program. Is one of the quotes that Rob made is, our assumptions become, I think Stratford from Alexander George, we have certain assumptions that essentially become self-evident verities. So I don't have a satisfactory response to that question, I'm afraid.
Well, just one more sentence on this, our capacity to read and analyze other people's governments and base our policies on this kind of analysis. Needless to say, we completely misjudged the Soviet Union. Just to highlight this very briefly, I used to teach Columbia University, and one of the nice things Columbia had, it would have seminars only for faculty. And I went to a seminar in the state, and among the participants were one guy known as Sam Huntington, and the other is Zbigniew Brzezinski, experts on the Soviet Union. And the consensus of the dinner was that Khrushchev is going to last for the next 100 years, and by the time I went home and listened to the radio, Khrushchev was gone. And I can spend the rest of the week further emphasizing that our capacity to read what's exactly happens inside another regime, I agree with Ray, is limited, and therefore we should not engage this criminology or Iranology and assume that we can base our policy on reading the tea leaves, above all because regime change. And so, like what happened to the Shah. So I think it's best if they don't have the means to kill, rather than to wait, that their intentions would be noble.
No, get the microphone.
Al Beagle, I'm a lecturer on Iran. One of the questions that was asked in the back, I'm not sure it was even answered in detail, is what can we do to support the Iranian people? Now, first, one has to assess what is the Green Movement position on the nuclear aspects, number one. Number two, have we given enough focus to human rights? And to answer his question in the back, the support of those elements, just as the Iranians are doing overseas counterproductively, why could we not equalize the situation and understand, focus on vulnerabilities, and do what is necessary in defense of regional interests? And we are doing that, $60 billion to Saudi Arabia. You see defections across the stream in terms of Iranian diplomats. As you pointed out, there's no bridge or no link between the population and the government. And this calls perhaps for regime change rather than a change of regime behavior if it's not working. But why haven't we used the human rights aspect, and what can we do to support the Iranian people?
Yeah, as I said, I think all your points are true. I just don't have, as with Mr. Aaron's question, I don't have a satisfactory answer for you. There's a new book that suggests that the containment doctrine toward the Soviet Union was heavily laden with covert actions. So the containment doctrine will have a covert capability, I suspect. You know, how do you mobilize or help to mobilization of a population which is disenchanted against your regime, against a regime? What tools do you use? Communication tools, covert assistance. I think you were talking about supporting various ethnic groups in Iran, the way Iran supports various sectarian and ethnic groups abroad, Shiis in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't know if the United States government has the capability and capacity to do that in societies which is unfamiliar with. We couldn't do it in Eastern Europe. Presumably, we had a greater degree of understanding of its norms and values and political vulnerabilities. I think this is a regime, there's a paradox here. I mean, you're quite right to point to it. The paradox is a regime that is immensely vulnerable, the regime that has mismanaged the economy, isolated the country, disenfranchised the population, is divided among itself. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but if you offer these data points to political scientists, they will say, well, this regime is in a pre-revolutionary stage. But I also know enough from reading history that things don't happen just because they should. I can't tell you how long the Islamic Republic will last. I believe whatever the duration of its longevity may have been, it has lessened and shortened as a result of the events of last summer. And my guess would be that the Islamic Republic is going to have a very difficult time of managing a succession to the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. I think it'd be very difficult for this political system to actually have a sort of a smooth succession as it did in 1989, which essentially means that at that time you can have a disintegration of the regime, which various blocs and contending faction and forces arrayed against one another. All the more reasons why that particular regime should not have a large depository of nuclear resources, because the future stability of the state is one of concern, I would say. But to answer your core question, I'm going to have to disappoint you, as I think I have disappointed others. Is I think you're right, but I just don't know how to do it.
Well, all I can tell you is what I was told when I spent 3 days in the Center for the Dialogue on Civilization in Isfahan, which was established by Khatami and by the reformers. Now, I frankly wouldn't make too much, but when some leaders told me, but I never heard any argument differently, and it has a little more weight. And first of all, they say they are anti-clerical, but they're nationalists, by which they mean they would like to see the religious regime removed. Quote, we want people to pray because they want to, and not because they're forced to. So they like to have a more open regime, but they would like it to have a nuclear program. It was very the full means of a nation. So that's one thing. Second, they pleaded with the CIA to desist, because the way they get discredited is by seeming to be agents of the CIA. By the way, the CIA is not exactly promoting human rights, it's promoting ethnic divisions, which is a whole other story. And so, for what it's worth, that's what I learned.
Just a final comment, picking up on the last question and a recurring theme in the discussion. First, on sort of the prospect for regime change. We have two timelines, the nuclear timeline and the societal change timeline, and they're not in sync. And this is a dilemma for us in policy terms. There have been analogizing to solidarity and to the revolution's various colors in Eastern Europe. The discontinuity in Eastern Europe was the Soviets didn't put the boot in. I mean, they did in '56, they did in '68. The discontinuity was they didn't crack down. Gorbachev was a qualitatively different leader. I'm not an Iran hand. I mean, is there any doubt that this regime, as what we saw in June, would put the boot in and suppress them? So the notion of a kind of Hungarian '56 kind of moral hazard of encouraging dissidents to believe that the outside world is going to come in and assist them. Covert operations, it's a whole other side, and there's the tainting issue that Amitai alluded to. I think Iran, the change will occur kind of in an organic way, primarily, and that's just what many kind of Iranians are saying. Now, in the cost-benefit analysis, Amitai is, of course, correct that we attach value to values, and so when you're doing cost-benefit analysis, dealing with some of the values that are associated with this regime, it is hard to make a cost-benefit analysis. But in international relations ain't the law of thermodynamics. Outcomes are indeterminate. If someone, there's been someone stated it's 1938 in Iran is Nazi Germany. If we knew that, okay, sign me up for preventive war. Okay, to be kind of provocative here. But we don't know that these outcomes are indeterminate, and there's a range of possibilities. I think the Obama administration has usefully kind of clarified the American position and set up this sort of structured choice. Unfortunately, we're not living in an era of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The states of concern to us, Iran, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Burma, the hard cases, Sudan, they are marginal actors in international relations. They don't pose a systemic threat. And I think we have to keep them kind of in perspective there. And just to kind of conclude on a kind of a Wilson Center type point, which is the need for constantly evaluating kind of and subjecting to rigorous scrutiny, such as through writings and occasions like this, key assumptions that become the drivers of policy. Thank you.
Given the richness of this discussion, it's with regret that I must say we're out of time. There will be a buffet lunch on the 5th floor. You're welcome to join us. But please join me in thanking our participants for this extraordinary afternoon.